Oh, good morning and welcome to another stream from the ACT Chess Association of the online events that are currently being run on chess.com. My name is Sean Press. I run these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association and produce these streams on the following day normally, and then a summary of what's happened the night before. But I'm going to start with some good news. Tuggeranong Chess Club, which meets at Vikings Club at Erindale here in Canberra, ACT in Australia, has gone back to face-to-face chess starting on Monday night. It's a restricted start-up for the club where only 20 players have been allowed to enter the tournament, but they did get a full 20 straight up, and the first round was held on Monday night. Canberra Chess Club, which meets on Thursday nights at the Hellenic Club in the Canberra City, is also going back starting this week. So starting tonight, actually, they'll be back and they're running a 3-week rapid with, I think, 3 rounds a night. I'm not sure what the restrictions are on that club in terms of who's turns up, but certainly regular members are welcome there. Gungahlin Chess Club, which I normally play at, we're still waiting on contact back from the Gungahlin Chess Club management, the Eastlake Chess Club management in Gungahlin, before we have a definite date for when we return. That means that some of the online events that we're running are now not going to run. Essentially, we ran them as a replacement for when the clubs weren't meeting, and now that the clubs are meeting, we're going to sort of scale back what we're doing. So that means the Monday night blitz has finished, and that's why there wasn't a summary on Tuesday. So no Monday night blitz because Tuggeranong Chess Club meets on Monday. There is still our Thursday standard event, which I'm going to run till completion, so there's another 3 weeks to go. Players who are playing in that but also are playing at the Canberra Chess Club need to get in touch with me to tell me that they're not playing on Thursday night online and instead of playing Thursday night face-to-face. As none of the ACT Chess Association clubs meet on Wednesday night, and because a number of people quite like the online events, we're probably going to keep running the ACTCA Wednesday Rapid, at least in the foreseeable future. So you're always welcome to come and join that if you're an ACT chess player. And last night we had our ACT Wednesday Rapid, played with a time limit of 10 minutes plus 2 seconds per move, and it was won by Tim Pearce and Malik Amir, who tied on 4 out of 5. Tim started off with 2 draws before beating Malik in, I think, round 4, and Malik won the other 4 games, both on 4, and tied in equal third were Nick Bear, and I'm going to say, my memory's now just completely shot, Miles Patterson. No, not Miles Patterson, sorry, it definitely wasn't Miles Patterson. Let me just double check that, and I will be able to tell you in 1 second as I rapidly look it up. Here we go. It was, in fact, drum roll, it was Glenn Ingham. Sorry, Glenn, for mixing you up there. And I'd like to give a bit of a shout out to Jerry Cheng, who finished on 2.5, 50%, including a win over Miles Patterson. And Jerry's one of our young juniors who is improving both in online chess, which he's mainly been playing, but with the return to street chess, both he and his brother Larry have also claimed another number of high-profile scalps over the board. But the game I'm looking at today was one played early in the tournament, and it was played between Tim Pearce and Stephen Mugford. And it was one of Tim's early draws, but there was a nice, interesting bishop ending that I will get to at some point. And sometimes it just shows that you play the right moves. You can make it difficult for your opponent to win, even if your opponent has an advantage. So we start with d4, e6. Now e6 is an interesting choice. And a number of players play a dual Dutch system in the case of c4, is what happened in this game. But they're also quite happy to play the somewhat dubious d5 in this position if their opponent plays e4. I know this is the French defense, but I'm just going to throw that in there. c4 instead, and then you go for the Dutch with f5. You could play d5, by the way, and just go straight into a Queen's Gambit decline. But g3 is the normal idea because the bishop's better placed on the long diagonal, because the argument is over the e4 square. Black wants to occupy it at some point. White will challenge it with a move like bishop g2. Bishop b4, knight c3, castles, bishop g5, pin and win. And I was a little bit surprised about bishop e7. If you're going to play it to g4 and then play it back to e7, maybe you just should go to e7. Obviously, there's some independent ideas with pinning the knight early. The other option is to play c5 here to try and attack the center, but I'm not sure that's entirely in the keeping of the opening. If you're going to play a system with an early c5 and a bishop on b4, again, instead of playing f5, the Nimzo-Indian defense of just playing the knight to f6, instead e6, knight f6, and then aim for the Nimzo setup with bishop b4, c5 at some point. Nonetheless, e3 was played, d6, small center for black, bigger center for white, h6. This looks attractive, but after bishop takes f6, which is actually a good principled choice, bishop takes f6, white is a little bit better, and we'll see why in a second. Especially if white had castled here, because you've got the bishop on the long diagonal. It's a question of how black's going to develop the queenside pieces in the short term. Move like knight to a6, and then knight to f4. And one of the reasons why h6 is somewhat dubious is because the g6 square is quite weak, and the knight can occupy that. The queen also has access to some squares on the king side. Instead, d5 was played, and this turned out to give black a move that black probably did want to play here, and that is e5. Okay, so now black has gone from the small center on d6 and e6 to a slightly bigger center on e5 and f5. And castles, and I've drawn lots of pretty arrows here, because one of the plans that black might have been trying here was to play queen e8, queen h5. Although once the knight on f6 has been exchanged, this plan isn't as effective because you don't have ideas like knight g4 and knight e4. On the other hand, if the queen does go to e8, the knight might go to b5 and c7. So I suspect this was the reason why a6 was played in this position. It is a bit slow though, but it does keep the knight out of b5. a4, just so that b5 doesn't get played, but I'm not sure that was a real issue. So we bring some more pieces out, and white gets e4 in. Now, against the Dutch, e4 is a move that's often desirable for white. And the but is that it's not so great if black has already played e5 or is in a position to play e5. This has been covered over the years by various Dutch specialists. I'm no expert in this opening, but this is certainly what I've read. And black took. Possibly better is to push on the king side here. If you're aiming for a king side attack as black with an opening like this, well, then f4 makes sense. G takes f4 is an interesting pawn sacrifice though. So pawn takes, knight takes. So certainly black has given up a pawn here for open lines. Knight c5, nice square now. And knight fe2, because otherwise the threat was bishop takes c3 and the rook on f4, the knight on f4 was hanging to the rook. So knight f2, and you can even get away with taking bishop takes c3 here. Knight takes c3, queen g5, looking for bishop h3, which would be absolutely devastating. And so queen c1 needs to be played. And then black has a choice. Black can either just swap queens or continue the attack with rook, trying to continue the attack at least with rook f4 here, blocking that. If we swap queens, queen takes, rook takes, bishop d7 is the right move here. You're going to gang up on the a pawn. b3 can't be played because the knight will just take straight away. And black is getting material back. And in fact, black is slightly better going into the endgame because of the white pawns on e4, d5, and c4, which kind of hamper the bishop on g2. And that actually becomes a theme later in the game. Instead, after f takes e4, knight takes, knight c5, and white has a couple of choices here. Knight takes c5, wrecking the pawn structure, d takes c5, knight c3, following up by knight e4 is not a bad strategy. Or knight takes f6, at least getting rid of one of black's bishops. Queen takes f6, b4, knight d7, and then a5, and we end up with a slightly weird pawn structure here on the queen side, which I think, if I remember my Hans Kamosh pawns power in chess, is slightly better for white because white's further advanced. If everything else came off, there's probably a breakthrough in this position that white can engineer, but not 100% sure. Instead, knight to c3 to defend, so swap knights, knight takes, bishop f5 to activate the bishop finally, knight takes f6, queen takes f6. Now, white had an interesting idea here with a5, and at first you think a5 is just a little move that really doesn't do that much, but the idea is that it tries to keep the b pawn sitting on b7, and then what you can do is try and swing some heavy pieces over to the queen side and gang up on the b pawn here. And if the pawn moves and you take, and the c pawn takes, then you play something like b4 and try and gang up on the a pawn. However, if you do that, you've just got to make sure your c pawn isn't an issue. So queen d2 was played instead. Rook a d8. Mystery move to me, to be honest. I'm not 100% sure what the idea with this one was. I thought that the rooks could be employed more effectively with ideas like rook f7 and the other rook coming across rook ac1. This one makes a little bit more sense because you're looking at pushing c5 in certain lines to try and open up on the queen side. So b6 was played immediately to stop c5 coming in. And queen c3, and the idea now is to play f4 here. And with the queen on c3, it restricts black's options slightly. So a5 was played, and of course f4 as predicted. Black went with e4. The other option is to take. Queen takes, rook takes, rook takes. Rook e8, aiming for the e2 square. Bishop f3 to keep that out, and rook e5. And black is fine in this position, I think, if not even with just a tiny edge. But ultimately, with symmetrical pawns, it's often hard to work out how you're going to win a game like this. e4. We could also try queen takes f6 here, rook takes f6, and king f2 with the idea of putting the king on e3. Often games like this, when you've got very few pieces left, and you're kind of in that crossover between the end game and the middle game, it's pawn structure that will often be the difference. If one side has a damaged pawn structure and the other side doesn't, then that means that the side with the damaged pawn structure has to defend a lot more weaknesses, which plays into the opponent's favour. So rook fe1 instead, let's gang up on the e-pawn, and this is what happens for the next few moves. Queen g6 defending, rook e3, rook fe8, rook ce1, rook e7. This comes back to my doubling the rooks strategy slightly earlier on. Queen to d4, rook d8, let's march the king here, let's march the king here, and h3. And again, as I said, with the heavy pieces on the board, it's kind of a half end game, still a half middle game. Normally the definition of a middle game, end game as far as I'm concerned is it safe to bring the king out without fear of getting checkmated? And in this case, both kings are starting to come out, so both players certainly think that it's safe enough. But the issue here is the e-pawn. The e-pawn's just been pushed a little bit further up the board, and obviously we can see that white is trying their best to capture it, and black is trying their best to defend it. And at this point, black makes a mistake and kind of drops the pawn with queen f6. The better move was h5, and at first it doesn't seem clear why this is better, but the idea is after b3, now we can play queen f6, as we'll see in the game continuation. Queen f6 straight away, runs into queen takes, king takes, and g4, and this is why h5 needed to be played first. With the pawn on h5, g4 doesn't work. Without the pawn, the bishop has to go back. Now, again, this is a little bit tricky. The plan here was to play f5, which white did, and it locks the bishop out. And essentially, black can't defend the e-pawn any longer, and white is going to win the e-pawn. Having said that, king g3 first might have been a little bit better. I mean, the threat of f5 really isn't going away. If you play g6, of course, you can still take the pawn because the bishop's not protecting. Because after f5, black could have still held the draw in this position with g6. Bishop takes e4, takes, rook takes, rook takes, rook takes, and we're just swapping everything off, and suddenly you've won back the pawn. Here, and then king f3, and it's completely equal. And neither player is going to lose this king and pawn ending without some sort of spectacular mistake. Instead, h5 was played now, And now bishop takes e4, h takes d4, h takes d4, king g5, bishop back to f3 to defend, swap, 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 swap. This ending should be better for white, but it's still tricky to win. And in fact, black then from this position actually held this ending, and we're going to see why. Couple of alternatives here. Could play g6 here after take and take. I think this position is now holdable. By the way, the plan that black eventually hit upon in here works, which is just simply reroute the bishop back to somewhere like g7. To d7, and there's no progress to be made. The king just sits here quite happily on g5, and there's no entry points in this position for white, and at the same time there doesn't seem to be a way of engineering a breakthrough on the queen side by moving pawns up. I could be wrong, but at least from what I've looked at, I couldn't see it happening. So king went back to f6, and at this point white probably missed the best chance in this position here to win the game, which is simply bishop e4 now. And for example, if we play king g5, then this is part of the interesting part of the ending that I was talking about. f6 exclamation mark. Obviously, if we take the bishop on e4, we just play f7 and we make a queen. If we take the pawn on f6, either with the g pawn or with the king, we lose the bishop on h7. And if we play bishop g8, then bishop h7 is a really nice follow-up. Because obviously if we take, again, f7, and we're making a queen. If we just take the pawn out of desperation, bishop takes g8, king takes g4, bishop e6, king back, king f3, and there's no way that pawn's becoming a queen, and eventually white will win this ending pretty simply. And if we play bishop f7 here, f takes g7 is enough, because we're going to promote on g8, and we're going to win the bishop, and white's going to win. Now, that's not entirely forced that whole line, but bishop e4 was the best try in this position to try and get that one going. Instead, king f4, g5 was a nice move for black, because it really does cut the king out of the game now. F takes, bishop takes, and if we play bishop f4 now, just bishop back to f7 is fine. Instead, after g5, king goes back to e7. Bishop to e4. We don't want to swap bishops. Essentially, swapping bishops gives white a winning king and pawn ending. But with bishops on the board, this helps black find enough free moves not to get zugzwanged, essentially. Bishop to c2, king over, king back to e3. So at this point, I think white realized that this position isn't as clearly winning as being a pawn up normally is. And so it's a question of trying to reorganize the pieces for some sort of breakthrough. So the king goes to e4, bishop to f3, king back here. And the idea is to play something like b4 in this case. And smartly, black doesn't capture. Because if black captures, then there is a slight risk, big risk, of the king infiltrating through the queen side, and then hitting c6 and taking the c7 pawn. So black sensibly sits on the position. Bishop f3, and after we take and take here, we can see quite clearly now what the problem is in this ending for white. And that is all white's pawns are on white squares with the exception of the g5 pawn. And because black's pawns are on dark squares, two things happen. One, there are no targets for the white bishop, so the white bishop just shuffles around. And two, black's pawns are arranged in such a way that it's very difficult to find an entry point into this position. King d4, and then black went, I'm going to try c5. Now again, it's a little bit risky, but the whole idea is to prevent c5, because after c5, white does create a chance of an entry point, which is to play the king to swap on d6 and then run the king around to b5. So c5 had to be calculated because you just want to make sure that a move like d takes c6, bishop takes, doesn't blow up in your face. King here, bishop back, king here, bishop f7, bishop f3, and then something like this. And basically there's a barrier that's just been constructed across the center of the board here. c5, d5, e5, f5, and the white king can't get past these squares. And if the white king can't get past these squares, then there's no win to be had. King to e3, we'll go back to g4, king to f4, and we'll go to d7. And again, there's this barrier across the center of the board here, e5, f5, and even g4. But also now, because of the swap of pawns on a5, the a pawn is weak for white as well. And so the bishop actually can sit quite happily around d7, e8, because if the bishop tries to get active, the white bishop that is, tries to get active to help the pawn through, then you've got to worry about dropping the a pawn. And around about here, even the engine that I was looking at this game went, oh, hang on, this is drawn, even though white's a pawn up. King g3, bishop e8, king to g4, bishop d7, king h5, bishop here. And basically there's nothing much. White went for one more try with g6, but now another pawn on the white square. No real dramas here. Bishop back to stop the king from trying to sneak through to e6. Bishop e8. King there, and they just repeated the position, and the game ended in a draw. I probably came across the position while looking at it around about here, where white was still black was still just working out the best way to draw the position. But in the end, black had no difficulty doing that. And so that ended in a draw. It was a good save by Stephen Mugford against a higher rated opponent, a pawn down. The good news for Tim Pearce was it didn't affect his final tournament results because he did go on to tie for first and basically win his remaining 3 games after he played this one. So thanks for tuning in. That was from last night's ACTCA Rapid Play event, which we hold every Wednesday night from 7 p.m. Canberra time. We're still going on with the August Standard, which is a long time control 45-minute plus 15-second tournament, but only probably for another 3 weeks. My name is Sean Press. I organise these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association, and I do the summaries the following day. So there'll be a summary tomorrow morning around about 10 a.m. for our standard event. And so until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.